Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you. Well, it's my enormous pleasure and privilege to be here for this incredible festival. And I'm so excited to hear the Schnittke. I wrote the little piece of mine that you'll hear performed tonight as well, actually in 1994. When I was 20, I was in my third or fourth year at university, and I had been, up until that point, studying the oboe as a performance instrument, and that's a story that carries forwards into the piece that will be performed in the weekend for horn, cello and violin, because I was given a choice of two instruments to play when I was a kid. One was the oboe and one was the French horn, and I chose the oboe. And so here I am at university studying the oboe as a performance instrument, but what I really, really wanted to be was a composer. And my father in 1993 died very suddenly. And it created a decision in me. I thought, all right, I'm not going to play the oboe anymore. This enormous event's happened in my life. I'm not enthusiastic about finishing this performance degree. I'm just going to stop and I'm going to do what it is that I really want to do. And the piece that you're going to hear tonight is very much a result of that decision and a result of how transformed I was by that event in my life. And it's probably the first piece of anything that I wrote when I was young that I believe represents who I am as a composer. And it was the first time I felt like I'd found any kind of language that represented what I hoped I could say. And that's also thanks in no small part to the Schnittke piano quintet that you're going to hear tonight. So I was, is it working? Hello. One moment, please. When I was studying at university, we had a wonderful professor of music history who was also a Russian scholar, and he knew Shostakovich, had met Shostakovich, and also personally knew Alfred Schnittke. And he was a huge enthusiast of Alfred Schnittke's music, but it wasn't something that was necessarily on the curriculum for composition students, so I wasn't learning about Schnittke as a matter of course as part of my musical studies. But this professor wanted to introduce the students at Auckland University to this composer, so one Saturday he organised for us to watch a documentary about him. And I remember it vividly. I think I can even remember the seat I was sitting in the music theatre when I went to see this documentary. It talked about Schnittke's life. We heard all sorts of strange and beautiful and interesting pieces of his music because he really is a fascinating composer. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But suddenly, the documentary moved along and he started talking about the death of his mother and how it had inspired him to write this piece of music. And this piece, the piano quintet, started to play. And I had one of those moments, where you just hear something and you cannot believe your ears. I'd never heard anything that sounded like it. And I couldn't really quite even process it. I was so astonished, to the point where I lost it, actually. I burst into tears, I was uncontrollably emotional and had to leave the room. Which is kind of, ruins the fact that I was supposed to be listening to that amazing piece of music. But anyway, and in those days, of course, you couldn't just then go and look for it online. It wasn't the sort of thing that would play on the radio. Ran down to Marbeck's on Queen Street, ordered it, waited, paid something like $60, which in those days was an enormous amount of money for a student, and then had to wait for 3 months for it to make its way from somewhere in Europe to me. And I can remember, that feeling of anticipation. Is this piece going to be what I remember? Is it going to be as amazing as I thought it would be? And I kind of sat down with my, shaking with excitement kind of situation and listened to it and just died 1,000 deaths again. And it has been, ever since, I think, probably the most important piece of music, just to me as a person and to me as a music creator as well. It's never far from my mind. There is an influence of it in the piece that you'll hear tonight. I also recently wrote a requiem
much bigger work for orchestra, and there is an element of this quintet throughout the Requiem. It was a building block of the Requiem and a kind of a homage to Schnittke as well. It wouldn't be obvious to a listener, but it's completely there. Schnittke is what he would call himself a polystylist. And what that means is that he takes all sorts of different musical styles and he just throws them at the wall, and you kind of hear a little bit of everything. And he does it shamelessly, and he doesn't try to hide it. It's juxtaposed, one thing next to another, crazy contrasts, dramatic, bold, devastating, brutal, and utterly beautiful. He said as a young, he said when he was alive, as a young composer, when he was alive, he said that he wanted to try to amalgamate serious music and light music without shame, without compunction. So you will hear waltzes and all sorts of other things coming into the piece, and then whatever world he's set up for you to be in, he will shatter it. And then he'll move on to another thing, and then he'll shatter that. And then finally, he will bring it all together in a way that makes such perfect and brutal sense. It will take your breath away, I promise. And if you hate it, then that's a good response too, because I think it's polarising music and it's okay to hate it. I think a strong feeling either way is the right feeling for a piece like this. That was a long answer.
Thank you. One of the themes of this festival is dimensions of identity. And it seems to me that your music, Victoria, is always from a very personal place. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the piece tonight in that regard, and also Goodnight Kiwi, which some of you will have heard in the Emerging Artist performance.
Well, I was apologising to the younger composers I was talking to earlier today because all of my music's about death. The piece for violin and piano was about the death of my father, and the landscape prelude that you heard earlier was about the death of my mother. So happy listening, everybody! It's going to be a rollicking night tonight.
But they're extremely beautiful. So what is it about the beauty of them?
So the piece for violin and piano, when Justine and Madeline played it for me a few days ago for the first time, and I hadn't heard it for a very long time, I became extremely emotional when I heard it then, because it brought back all of the ways that I was feeling at the time that I wrote it, which was shortly after my dad had died, as I said before. And I think I was so shell-shocked at that time, and I think that the piece gives a sense of that being trapped in a moment. There's so much space in it. It's just that sense of being utterly stunned, having been hit by something that you couldn't possibly have anticipated, and being awash in feelings that you couldn't have ever comprehended. And so it has that energy. It's got a very spacious aesthetic, but it's everything that's in that space. It's kind of a description, the emptiness of it and the silence of it, in a way, is what I was trying to express.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
In terms of the writing of these pieces that are incredibly beautiful, very emotional, very spacious. Generally, your music is amazingly spacious, and I think it takes a lot of courage to write that way. I've said that before. Where does that how does that music present itself to you?
How does it arrive in my mind?
Or, yeah, in your compositional process, where does that music come from? Or is it an intuitive thing? Is it how is it coming out onto the page? If that makes sense.
It is a kind of intuitive thing. If there's a piece in me that needs to be or wants to be written, it normally starts out as a form of, I guess the best word I could use is anxiety. So I have a sense of being unsettled, and it's usually, that's I think probably why my music is so personal, is because it's a direct expression of an emotional state. And then it comes to me sitting down, usually at the piano, and trying to find the language of whatever that feeling is. So in the case of this piece that you'll hear tonight, it was one particular kind of feeling, and with the Goodnight Kiwi, I was, my mother was very sick, and we were going through actually quite a beautiful process of talking about her life, looking at photographs, and the sense of nostalgia and the sense of kind of bittersweetness that gave me was the feeling that I was trying to express in Goodnight Kiwi. And so I would sit at the piano and I would just play with sounds, and I would try and find the order of notes or the organisation of notes that would somehow communicate or somehow satisfy whatever that thing was that I was looking for myself, within myself, I should say. And that's always how I've written my music. I sometimes wish that I had a more robust intellectual process for it, because I think that there's so much more that you can do with ideas. But at the same time, you also have to just surrender to your own identity and be who you are, and you can't make a piece something that it doesn't want to be. So I just let them come out the way that they are, and then I tend to obsess over them a little bit, and then you have to walk away.